panel. This is a very exciting one because it's going to be speaking about abolishing ICE and abolishing the police as the panel. And excuse me, and I'm sorry, Samah, I want to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, I apologize, is going to be presenting as our keynote, as our second one specifically on this topic. And it looks like her presentation's already up, so if you can't see it, can you put something in the chat or in the Q&A so that we can make sure that all the tech things are good to go? And yes, thank you, so welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Jamila. As was stated, my name is Samah Sisay, and I'm so honored to be here today. I actually remember attending this conference in person last year, October, and being so grateful to have space to engage in both radical imagination and critical analysis of our collective work. And today has really been no different. I was incredibly moved by Helena's keynote and the previous panel, and I feel like I have learned so much from everyone. So thank you all for putting this together. My life mission is abolishing oppressive systems and building a world where Black people globally have what we need to be free and to live abundant lives. And I say Black people specifically because systems of policing and criminalization are globally rooted in white supremacy and anti-Blackness. You know, I am a lawyer at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where I use litigation and advocacy alongside movements to challenge the violent and anti-Black US immigration and criminalization systems. And this includes challenging policies at the Mexico-US border that were specifically implemented to keep Haitians and other Black immigrants from accessing the asylum process. It also includes fighting for the release of immigrants facing endless detention and abuse in immigration jails, and pushing for an end to the New York City Police Department's radical targeting and violence towards communities of color. And I also volunteer and organize with a coalition called Survived and Punished New York, which has really framed my understanding of abolition. And Survived and Punished uses prison industrial complex abolition as a framework and a practice towards ending the criminalization, imprisonment, policing, and the surveillance of survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And this framing and this work is so important because for many survivors, especially Black, queer, Indigenous, and immigrant survivors, gender-based violence is bound up in the systems of incarceration and police violence. So I want to spend this hour with you all really discussing my abolitionist journey. I very much still consider myself a student, so I don't have all the answers, but I have learned so much over the past few years that I would like to share with you all. I will discuss some foundational ideas of abolition as a practical tool, not just a future vision. I also will point to current examples of abolitionist steps within the immigrant justice movement and discuss the need for both imagination and, but as I stated before, action in order for us to achieve open borders, which should be our ultimate goal, not immigration reform. Everything I'm sharing today, I learned from others, particularly Black queer women who took the time to engage me in political education and helped me develop my own analysis of my lived experiences. So we can move on to the next slide. So speaking of people who shaped me, I love these quotes from Mariame Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, two Black women who have written extensively about abolition and have led various abolitionist campaigns. I particularly love these quotes because they articulate my journey to abolition, which required extensive amount of political education in order to, like I said before, really contextualize my lived experiences, but also required a deep desire to build a new life-affirming world. So my journey towards abolition began outside of the US. I was born in Monrovia, Liberia during the country's civil war, a war where sexual violence was used as a tool of control. My first memories are of war and the violence of borders. I remember being told stories of family members being internally displaced during the war, of family members dying because they did not have the necessary papers to leave the country. Stories of my own parents barely escaping a sinking boat as they tried to flee to Guinea for safety. My family eventually did escape, and we arrived in the US in 1999, right when the second Liberian Civil War broke out, a second war that was even more deadly and took many more lives. However, life in the US as low-income Black immigrants presented its own violence and hardships that highlighted the precarity of our immigration status and disposability by the state. I tell this story because it frames why I do this work and why I believe that prison industrial complex abolition and border abolition must be the ultimate goal of the immigrant justice movement. Policing and borders are violent instruments of control and criminalization. Borders are deadly for many, right? Yet for others, open borders is already a reality because of class and racial privileges, and also an arbitrary designation called citizenship. But what does it mean to be the citizen of a country, right, that has stolen land, wealth, and then uses militarism and imperialism to cause chaos and violence around the world, and then closes its borders, and then punishes migrants for trying to find some semblance of safety? And while I'm talking specifically about the Mexico and US borders today, it's really important to understand that the struggle for abolition and open borders is global, as we heard from the past panel and from Helena's wonderful presentation, right? It's a global struggle from Germany to South Africa, to Turkey, to Palestine, and beyond. You can go to the next slide. So talking a lot about political education, I wanted to take some time to really explain what I mean when I'm using certain terms like prison industrial complex abolition. I think abolition as an idea has gained a lot of mainstream attention, especially after the summer global resistance against anti-Blackness and police killings. But I think a lot of people don't really fully understand what is meant when we say abolition. So first, I'm going to start with the definition of prison industrial complex, which is a definition from Critical Resistance, a wonderful group doing abolitionist organizing here in the US and beyond. So the prison industrial complex, or the PIC, is a term that describes the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And, you know, it's really important, I think oftentimes when people think of abolition, they just think of the prison itself, but the PIC includes immigration detention, policing, alternatives to detention like ankle monitoring. It includes border walls and border surveillance and so much more. Through its reach and impact, the PIC helps and maintains the authority of people who get their power through racial, economic, and other privileges. There are many ways this power is collected and maintained through the PIC, including creating mass media images that keep alive stereotypes of people of color, poor people, queer people, immigrants, as, you know, criminals, delinquents, deviant, not deserving, as was discussed in the previous panel. And this power is also maintained by earning huge profit for companies that deal with prisons, police forces, and borders, and helping politicians gain power through this idea of being tough on crime, and also eliminating social and political dissent, right? By oppressed communities that are demanding self-determination and a reordering of power in the US. I'm thinking especially of the ways borders and immigration laws have been used to deport and punish people who have demanded more from this country, right? From Black communists like Claudia Jones to Cameroonian and Congolese asylum seekers who were hunger striking in immigration detention, immigration jail, and as a result were deported to deadly situations just a few weeks ago. Okay, next slide. So when we talk about abolishing the PIC, it's really about a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance. So abolition, and I think this is incredibly important, and I feel like I'm going to keep repeating this, abolition is both a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal, right? So I think folks often think of abolition as some utopic idea, and that's not what it is. Like, abolition provides us with the tools to move towards the world that we want to build. And abolition, specifically in the US, has its roots in movements to abolish slavery, and in many ways provide movement and rights to Black people who were enslaved in the US. And what we saw is, in response to these abolitionist efforts, policies like the Fugitive Slave Act, which forcibly returned Black people to bondage, even if they escaped the borders of slave states, and Jim Crow laws, which enforced segregation and limited the movement of Black folks inside the US, were passed, showing that abolition is a constant struggle, even when we have wins. And these efforts also led, and this is a circular thing, right, and shows the absurdity of migration in a lot of ways. These efforts also led to the colonization of a small country on the west coast of Africa called Monrovia, after James Monroe, which is current day Liberia, where I was born. And so, Liberia was founded as a home for formerly enslaved Black Americans because many people believe that the US's deeply racist white society would never accept Black liberation. However, I think this colonization project highlights how our abolitionist efforts can be harmful, especially to Indigenous communities, without an intentional internationalist and anti-imperialistic lens. I think today can be really difficult to imagine what abolition is going to look like, and that's okay, right? It's okay because the current systems of violence do not have the answers and yet are heavily funded even though they don't know what they're doing and they're causing harm. It's important though, I think, as we take these steps to remember again that abolition isn't just about getting rid of buildings full of cages or physical border walls. It's about undoing the society we live in, because the PIC both feeds and maintains oppression and inequalities through punishment, violence, and controlling millions and millions of people. It means developing practical strategies for taking steps that move us towards our dreams and lead us to believe that things could be different, right? It means living this vision in our daily lives. Next slide. So when thinking about present day tools and how to use abolition, a lot of abolitionist organizers, specifically Dane Spade and Mariame Kaba, have pushed this idea of abolitionist steps or non-reformist reforms versus reformist reforms, right? So an abolitionist step is a practical effort that changes aspects of the prison industrial complex towards completely dismantling the system, right? Whereas a reformist reform is just a tweak or a change to the system that continues to expand the reach of the prison industrial complex. Reformist reform make the system seem nicer on its face while allowing it to continue causing violence in the daily lives of those who are most impacted. So within the context of the immigrant justice movement, there are a lot of reformist reforms. Do we really just want to ask for reforms for warmer cages or nicer versions of ICE and Border Patrol? Or do we want to uproot these systems of violence and demand life-affirming societies? What does it mean to give CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, more money to quote unquote take care of people in cages versus slashing their budget and demanding the release of those incarcerated, right? The whole point of abolitionist steps is to not increase the scope, the scale, or the life of the PIC. Rather, it's about taking power away from these systems through control measures, through defund movements, and thinking about different ways to order our society. Next slide. So again, taking from Dane Spade and Mariame Kaba, these are some questions that were developed to really ask yourself when you're doing a campaign or making specific demands as to whether or not the demand you're making is actually just a reformist reform that's just tweaking the system, or whether it's an abolitionist step towards dismantling the PIC. So the first question is, does it provide material relief? So that means, does it actually end the harm, or does it provide reparations for harm that already occurred? And I think that's incredibly important in thinking about our work, especially within the immigrant justice field. The second question is, does it leave out a particularly marginalized group, right? The immigrant justice movement is notorious for this. If you think about many of the things that folks have demanded and viewed as wins in the past, they are carve-outs, oftentimes leaving out people with criminalization or with criminal convictions, oftentimes allowing the state to determine who is deserving and who is not. The third question is, does it legitimize the system, right? So I'm thinking specifically within the immigrant justice movement, we're seeing a huge calling for an independent immigration court, independent immigration judges. And so at the end of the day, that demand still leads to people being deported, right? And it legitimizes the system, because what that call is saying is that if only this court or these people were not bound by the executive, they would have more legitimacy in the work that they're doing. And that's not true. Like we know that this type of violence occurs in criminal courts all the time. And those are independent courts that still put people in cages and are still racially violent. The fourth question is, does it build power, mobilizing the most affected for ongoing struggle, right? So I'm thinking specifically about a lot of movements or efforts that are lawyer or legislative led that don't include people who are most impacted. Because all that does is give the people who already have power the ability to pat themselves on the back that they did something good, but it doesn't actually mobilize the communities who are most impacted or give them more power to continue their struggle for freedom. Next slide. Yeah, so like I said before, I did, that was like a brief political education. I hope it was helpful in the framing of abolition and trying to make the idea of abolition more concrete as to steps that we can take today to move towards an abolitionist future. But I also wanted to provide examples of things that I think are great steps towards abolition that are happening within the immigrant justice movement. And I also wanted to make a comment about that. I've been talking a lot about the immigrant justice movement, but I do think that this binary that is often created between immigrant rights, racial justice, and criminal justice are completely false. We know that all these systems of criminalization and violence are connected, and so our movements need to be connected. And I feel like folks within the immigrant rights and immigrant justice movement have so much to learn from people who have been doing criminal justice and racial justice work, and that us combining our efforts and really thinking of abolition of the police, of ICE, and of borders as a connected effort is really, really important. So one powerful strategy for freedom and decriminalization that I believe is an abolitionist step are participatory defense campaigns. Defense campaigns are rooted in grassroots efforts to pressure those in power to free prisoners, to raise awareness about conditions in cages, and oftentimes to raise funds for people's freedom campaigns. Participatory defense campaigns are also steeped in Black radical tradition. So a lot of people know about, for instance, the Free Angela and All Political Prisoners campaign, which was a vast international movement in the early 70s to free Angela Davis and raise awareness about the US's targeting of Black radicals and also surveillance of Black Muslims. And defense campaigns are so powerful because they use the experience of one person to tackle the injustice of the whole system, right? The campaign should not be framed with a message that like this one person is more deserving and so they deserve to be out of jail, but rather it's saying that this individual case frames the issues with the system as it exists and therefore explains why the thousands and millions of people who are in similar situations should be free. So Survived and Punished California, which is an arm of Survived and Punished National, did a defense campaign for a woman named Leah, who is an Ethiopian immigrant survivor of domestic violence, and is facing deportation from the US for defending herself against her abusive ex-husband. She served years in California State Prison for a criminal conviction when she tried to defend herself. And she was then transferred to ICE custody after serving her criminal prison term, because in the US and in California specifically, many local prisons work with ICE and will transfer people to ICE custody. So in March 2020, due to amazing advocacy, Leah was finally freed from immigration detention, but she continues to fight her deportation case. And again, the reason why Survived and Punished focuses on these various intersections of migration, gender violence, and criminalization is because we recognize that criminalization does not end violence, right? It simply allows the state to inflict even more violence on incarcerated individuals, their families, and our communities. About 90% of criminalized people who are incarcerated have some history of physical or sexual abuse before incarceration. And so for those who survive abuse, the criminal legal system serves as the next abuser in their lives through aggressive character assassinations, monitoring their movements and phone calls, shackling and invasive strip searches, and creating an environment of punishment and fear. And, you know, like I was talking about before about leaving people behind, I think what's also great about Leah's case is that oftentimes in the immigrant rights movement, we leave people with criminal convictions behind. And I believe that's steeped again in that anti-Blackness that exists within the US, right? And even though we understand that the US criminal system disproportionately targets Black communities, that narrative is left out of the fight for immigrant justice. And, you know, crime is a construct that the state expands to punish those that it views as unworthy. And so we're not doing ourselves a favor by not addressing this issue. But the reason why I think Leah's case is also really great is because it's not a singular case. I think that the immigrant justice movement has really learned from folks who have been doing prison abolition and criminal justice work for a while. And so now, you know, we have thousands of people, you know, demonstrating care for criminalized individuals and using various tactics to get people free and to really shame the system as it exists. And so I'm thinking of defense campaigns that are here in New York, including the campaign for Ravi Rakbir and Usman Darboe. And it just shows the importance of the joining of our movements, because historically, criminal justice and prison abolitionist spaces have been more visionary than the immigrant justice space, because the immigrant justice space focuses so heavily on morality and on like who's deserving a place in the US and who's deserving of US citizenship. And we really need to break away from that. Next slide. Another great example, I think, of abolitionist step or campaign that is happening here in the US, specifically in New York and New Jersey, is the effort to end Hudson County's contract with ICE. So cage closures and cage closure campaigns are important abolitionist steps because the abolition of these places is so important for the well-being of those who are criminalized in cages. But it's also important because these campaigns always bring up larger questions about the society we want to live in and our ability to demand more than what we think the system can provide to us, right? So in Hudson County, New Jersey, there's a contract with ICE that has existed since the 1990s. It was most recently reapproved in 2018, allowing ICE to continue housing immigrant detainees, so people who are detained during their immigration proceedings, their immigration case, at the Hudson County Correctional Facility. Hudson County gets paid because of this ICE agreement. They get paid per detainee or per person who's detained. And, you know, when they were renewing the contract in 2018, they claimed that, you know, after that renewal, they would try to take steps to end the contract. However, that contract expires in December of this year, but the county is trying to renew it. They're trying to go back on their word. And what we have seen happening is that this fight to end this contract and to end the detention of immigrants in Hudson County has really brought up a lot of the issues within the immigrant justice movement, and why so many people in the space are not fully pushing forward a vision of abolition, right? And so, you know, during the time when there was a fight in 2018 to really close or to end the contract and end the detention of folks in Hudson County, you had lawyers, right? You know, and advocates saying, well, if we end this contract and people are no longer detained here, ICE is going to transfer them out of the state. They're going to be far away from their family members. They're going to lose access to legal representation. And those are the same arguments that now ICE and the Hudson County officials are using as to why they can't end the contract. So we literally just fed them the arguments that they're now using to expand the system. And I think it just shows how these reformist ideas can later be used against us, because it doesn't matter whether or not the conditions at the Hudson County facility have improved. I mean, it does matter on a very basic level for the humanity of people who are detained there. But if we're thinking about our long-term goal of abolition, it doesn't matter because it still leaves people in cages. And so I think why this campaign is so important is it shows the importance of these difficult conversations. And it shows why the efforts that are led and employed by lawyers in the US legal system are often void of imagination. And it often leads to dangerous compromises that leave people behind, leave people in cages, right? And, you know, I always say this, we have the power to do so much more than that. And I think it's so difficult for us to imagine that we collectively have the power to demand the end to this contract and the mass release of all those who are detained there, because it's not even up to 100 people. We are able to do that, yet people see it as a losing fight and give up and compromise before, you know, like before the system that exists already tells them no. They're already constraining themselves. And that's sort of the way the law works and how it constrains our imagination as to what we can achieve in the future. Next. So, you know, as I said in the beginning, I don't have all the answers, but I do know that the system, right, that we have now is a violent and it's a deadly one. You know, we heard so much from Helena and the speakers in the last panel that really speaks to this being a global issue, right? And the people claiming to implement immigration laws and border security for our protection just keep gaining money and power while so many suffer. So it's really time for us to demand what we want, what is necessary, not just what we think we can get, right? And so I think honestly, and I'm speaking specifically to people who are doing immigrant rights work, who may be lawyers or advocates in the space, to think about what it means to be bold in our campaigns and our ask, to not just tell the system of oppression what it wants to hear for, like for these momentary wins, these small wins that still allow this violence to keep happening. Our future looks like abolition. It looks like anti-militarism and open borders. And I think why it's so hard to wrap our heads around this is because those may not be things that we can necessarily achieve through litigation or through the law. But in our efforts to win these legal cases and implement these short-term policies, we're leaving people behind. We're not telling certain stories. And we are further legitimizing this system of racism and violence. So what does it mean to compromise when the very things you're fighting for is something you'll have to fight to dismantle in the future, right? If this system is built on white supremacy and violence, what more do you expect from it? It's going to keep replicating itself. So why do we keep asking this violent and racist system to be something it just cannot be, instead of abolishing it as it exists and demanding what we really want? And I just also wanted to speak specifically to my own fears around discussions of border walls, right? I think specifically, again, speaking to the US context, we've seen a lot of people being relieved by the thought of Donald Trump no longer having executive power in this country and a Biden administration having power next year. And, I think while many people in the US over these past 4 years have shown public anger at the thought of a physical border wall, what will they show that same anger towards, as others were talking about, these proposal of smart walls that the Biden administration will most likely promote, right? The using of drones, of sensors to help surveil and identify people crossing the border, right? And I say this because I think what is going to happen, what has already been happening, is this idea of these alternatives, yet they're carceral alternatives that still cause violence, right? We may not have a physical wall, but if there's still surveillance happening, people are going to die, right? People are going to be criminalized, people are going to be detained. If someone is not in a physical cage, but we're promoting alternatives to cages like ankle monitoring, they're still being surveilled, they're still being criminalized, right? If we get rid of MPP or the Remain in Mexico policy or metering, does that mean it actually ends, or does it mean that we're just expanding detention, right? And I think these are important questions to think about moving forward, because abolition is about the ending of all forms of criminalization. It's not about replacing them with more palatable or less visible, forms of punishment. And so, like I said before, collectively, we have the power to not choose criminalization and fear as the basis of how we function. We need to reject these systems of violence and death. We have the imagination and the power to create life-affirming societies. And that's not to say that the process will be easy or quick or without struggles, but simply that it's possible, right? And there are steps we can be taking today, right now, to get there. And by choosing abolition, we choose life, and we choose abundance. Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredible. Thank you so very much. I'm sorry, I was actually live tweeting of what you were saying because it was all amazing. So thank you so much for speaking with us today and for coming to the conference last year and wanting to be a keynote this year. We're so grateful. And honestly, the knowledge that you've just brought is so important and really bridges together all of the work that we're really trying to build towards. That it's not just siloed migration issues, right? We all know that it's systemic, broader violence that's going across the spectrum. So, I'm going to go ahead and transition it over to Dave. It looks like his camera just popped on, and go from there for Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamila. I just wanted to pass it over to Steve, who I think is going to read out some questions in the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, David. I'm just trying to turn my video on. Oh, there we are. Hi, I'm Steve Sacco. I'm one of the steering committee members, along with David and Jamila and some others. And I wanted to just field the Q&A for Samah and after her amazing presentation. The first question is actually in Spanish, which unfortunately I don't speak. I'm wondering if someone can translate it for me.
I can go ahead and read it for you in English, Steve. So the first question is, where or how can we unify so that this movement continues to grow, educate ourselves?
I'm so sorry. We actually can't hear. It's kind of quiet. Maybe I'm the only one.
Adriana, could you repeat that question?
Yes, can folks hear me?
Now, yes. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Where or how can we unify so that this movement continues to grow, educate ourselves?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think, as was obvious in my presentation, I'm a huge proponent of political education because I think so many of us have lived experience that we don't necessarily have the words or the time or space because we live in capitalistic societies to really contextualize. So I think education is definitely a huge part of it in really understanding the violence of the system, but also in uplifting us as a society. And I'm speaking broadly at saying us, but to really have space to imagine something different. But in terms of unification, I think that, as I was saying before, there seems to be this weird separation of our movements, whether it's the movement for, whether you want to call it immigrant rights or migration rights or refugee rights, and domestic and international movements against policing. And I think that does us a disservice and only helps these systems that are oppressing us because they're all the same. And I think there's power in us joining together and recognizing that we have a lot to learn from each other. Yes, the experiences are different. Yes, we're pulling from maybe different lived experiences, but overall, our ultimate goal is abolishing these systems of violence and surveillance. And so I think that sort of unification and doing work at the intersections is really important if we're going to build this movement and move forward. So I'm thinking right now in the US, there's a huge defund movement happening around the police, right? People are finally saying like the police are racist. They're not actually protecting people. Why are they getting more money? We need to defund them. Yet somehow that discussion is completely separate from ICE. People were saying abolish ICE, yet for some reason that joining hasn't happened in recognizing that ICE, is the police and the ways that that movement can be grown if we were just joined together. And so, yeah, I'll stop there. I think a joining of movements and political education is really important in growing.
Thank you so much. There are a lot of questions here, so I'm just picking and choosing because of limited time, unfortunately. The next question comes from Pueblo Sin Fronteras, which asks, what do you think is the most effective way to redirect reformist arguments that you cited in Hudson County towards abolition?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question and something a lot of wonderful advocates are working on right now. I think, I don't exactly, I think it was Salim in the last panel discussed this idea of I don't think he used the word collective care, but it was essentially collective care. And so I think in a lot of ways, people view the state as the only one that's able to make the decisions about how our communities are organized and how we're able to protect and care about each other. And I think for me personally, when I think of the heart of the argument as to why this contract will not end, I think it's because of these ideas of fear and these ideas of othering. And this belief that these advocates who are out here saying, like, we can come together with a plan, right, to figure out how to get people released. We can do this work to care for people in the way they deserve to be cared for so that they're not in cages. And the state is saying, no, we have to cage them in order to have some semblance of order and safety. I think that's the issue. And I mean, there's many more issues, but I think it's one of the issues. And so I think really giving resources to local groups that are doing this work that understand what it means to provide care that is not based on criminalization is really important. I think there's so much more that needs to be done, but I'll stop there just so other questions can be asked.
Okay, great. Next question comes from Azadeh Irfani. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing. Appreciate the ways in which you acknowledge the limitations of litigation and the practice of law to bring about abolitionist steps. Can you say more about how attorneys can overcome the limits of their training and imagination to advance abolition?
Yeah, as an attorney, this is a question I'm struggling with a lot. But I think I was actually on a student panel recently where a student said something that really, I think, framed it for me and contextualized how I think about it. I think, unfortunately, law school and the law is an exercise in constraint, right? And regardless of how well-meaning or even radical of lawyers we want to be, our job is to work within that system that constrains, and it constrains, right? It puts limits on what we can do. And so I am all for working with people who are not within the legal profession because I think it helps take away some of that constraint and expand our imagination about what can be achieved. So I think most, and this is what I appreciate about my work at CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, is really being able to work with movements, organizers, directly impacted people, and advocates who are not necessarily, always thinking about how to navigate these specific, particular legal things, but instead are thinking of the larger picture. And I think it adds so much to litigation to do work in coalition with people who are not lawyers, and helps and pushes us and to expand our vision of like how we can maybe obstruct the law in some ways, or maybe not even care about what is traditionally thought of as a win within the law, but instead use the law to uplift ideas that otherwise would not be uplifted.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question comes from Melissa McSwain. What are your thoughts on disentanglement policies as reformist versus abolitionist? Does ending collaboration between police and ICE move us in the right direction and reduce the reach of the PIC?
Yes, I actually do. So I know there are a lot of campaigns trying to get rid of, like, for instance, SMP New York, Survived and Punished New York is doing a campaign right now about ending ICE transfers. So like the transfers from local jails and prisons to ICE custody in California. I know a lot of advocates have been doing work to end contracts between police, local police and ICE. I mean, I can understand. For me, I think that they are abolitionist step, depending on how you go about them. I think there's a motto of going about it that where you talk about, you know, like the money and things like that, that could then be used against you in the future. But I think as I have seen these policies implemented, they've been done in a way of really trying to reduce the power of ICE, and also in a lot of ways to reduce the power of the jails and the local police departments in what ways they can control people.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Rachel Rudder. We are a legal service organization representing children in immigration proceedings. How can we move towards an abolitionist framework as we are representing children within this system? Is there a way to represent folks in this system without legitimizing it?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Rachel. Especially the last part, is there a way to represent folks in the system without legitimizing it? Because it's something I think deeply about a lot. Yeah, I think within the US, we see a lot of discussion about children in cages, and I think it's just an incredibly terrible policy. But I think the focus on that is really, again, going to this conversation of, you know, who's deserving and who's not. We saw this a lot in the discussion around DACA versus DAPA, right? And this idea that children are innocent. Children are more deserving of humanity and of certain considerations. And I understand how that, you know, it can be very useful within a legal system and especially within a political system like the US. But I think one step maybe to that can help towards an abolitionist framework is just your framing of the work and how you're doing it. Because in my eyes, you know, this work shouldn't be about who's deserving and who's not deserving. And yeah, I'll stop there. So I think that framing is really problematic at times, and a lot of organizations that do represent children push it forward in a lot of ways.
Thank you. The next question comes from Orlando Lara. Is it possible to create a non-carceral state through abolitionist practice, or do we also need to abolish the state from itself or reimagine the very nature of collective governance and collective care?
Oh, yeah. So when I talk about abolition, I do want to state that, like, all abolitionists do not agree, right? And that's completely okay. I think it's fine to have disagreements within movements. There are definitely abolitionists who are anarchists and think the state should not exist. And then there are folks who believe that we can abolish certain systems and replace them, if you will, with institutions or ways of organizing society that are not focused on criminalization. To tell you the truth, I don't know where I stand with that. I think because the state exists as it is, I probably am leaning towards the latter and just working towards, like, the abolishment of these carceral systems. But you know, that's the real question. Like, what does it mean to do that work within a nation state that continues to have power over people? And I unfortunately just don't have the answer to that, but it is a struggle that people have been talking about.
Final question comes from Gita Schwartz. there's some explanation before the question. On the one hand, legal representation for detained people and people in immigration proceedings can reduce harm on an individual basis, sometimes on a fairly large scale. On the other, universal representation can legitimize the system and strengthen the deserving, non-deserving categories, as you discussed. Where do you situate calls for universal representation in the PIC abolitionist framework? Can it be considered an abolitionist step?
Oh, hi, Gita, with the difficult questions. Yeah, no, I agree that oftentimes calls for universal representation feed into this idea of deserving versus those who are not deserving, and in a lot of ways try to frame the criminal system or the immigration system as it exists, similarly to the criminal system, and this idea that, well, in the criminal system, people have access to representation, so why shouldn't immigrants? To tell you the truth, I personally see them as steps that are needed because of how the system is currently organized. I think most calls for universal representation are about representing people who are detained and who have criminal convictions. And so I think they're focused on folks who are marginalized and often left out of the discourse. And also provide material relief to people because they are not able to navigate the system oftentimes because of the way that it's set up to be so violent without it. But I also do recognize the harms of it and how the money, and this is what I think we're seeing within the arguments from Hudson County, is the money that then goes towards universal representation is then used against advocates and limits what they can ask for and what they can demand in trying to abolish the system. Because then the argument is, well, they have lawyers, the jails are nice, there's no need to abolish the prisons. So I see both hands of it, and it's something I struggle with, understanding the necessity of this call in the current system, but understanding the harm that it causes as well. So thank you for the question.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, are there any final questions? I think that we're about to actually need to wrap up anyway. So that was a really wonderful way to end. I'm so grateful that you discussed solutions as well. I feel like that's a really important piece, and that we often are so driven by, personal experience and what we see every day. And we talk about the issues, but we don't talk about what are the real remedies and solutions that we can do collectively. So thank you so much for that and taking the time for today. I know it's a Saturday, and all of you all, thank you for coming. So we're going to go ahead and do a quick wrap up real quick, if that's okay. And I just want to thank you one more time. Can we give a round of applause one more time for Samah, please? I'm going to do a little awkward clap. I don't know. I can't do the clapping emoji in my chat, I found out. So there's that. But we're going to go on break.